And joining us now on the debate, Adam Daifala, co-founder and partner at Hatley Strategy Advisors in Montreal. Daniel Draish, professor of political science at York University. John Willis, director of campaigns and research at Strategic Communications, Inc. And we welcome back Sakura Saunders from Occupy Toronto. It's good to have everybody around this table here. And Adam, you've been on this program many times, but I don't think ever in this studio.
First time in the studio.
First time in the studio, so nice to have you.
Happy to be here.
Long overdue. Daniel, let me start with you. We don't necessarily have to go back to 1789 and the French Revolution and talk about people trying to change the world, but help us with the history here. When do we traditionally, historically, see big movements for change emerging?
Well, I think they happen in two different ways. First, what I call non-program surprises to announce new actors. So when there is new social actors that they first look towards social movement to present their issues. So this is like particularly where we see with the new social media, where you have a generation, this is really a generational issue, of young people under 30 speaking out for basically a democratic agenda against equality, et cetera, what we heard before. Mm-hmm. The other, I think, important aspect of when they appear is when you have a crisis in capitalism and you have technological change of a massive variety. And that's where you get the bounce. That's where you get something really big taking place, where values and relations are challenged by economic crisis and technology together.
Sounds like that's what we got going on right now.
It's quite an amazing story because if you look at, since 2000, over 2 billion people have joined the global economy, right? It's actually a bit before, but China, India. So of course there's a huge change taking place in the global south and their emergence as significant market actors. And on the other hand, you have this crisis in capitalism and the introduction of this new technology, very intense. Remember, in 1995, you had 20 million people on the internet. Today, we have over 2 billion, almost 2.2. And in terms of cell phones began in roughly around the same period. You have about 20 million users. And today, we have over almost 2 billion people using cell phones. So there's something about this, the intensity of spread of new information technology, which empowers the user. And that's why you have all these social movements, because the transaction costs to be an activist have fallen dramatically, and you can form social movements with this new technology.
Let me do one more follow-up with you, which is this. When was the last time you saw this kind of marriage of doubts about capitalism with cataclysmic technological change?
Probably, if we look back far enough, we think of the 30s with the collapse of capitalism. And, you know, it was so different. The social movements were class-based, tied to trade unions, tied to city movements, tied to people who were homeless who had been evicted from their property. But I think also what sticks in the minds of probably your viewers is really the civil rights and the end of war in Vietnam, because that was, again, a very different kind of social movement. You know, it had leaders, it had a strategy, it had an enemy, Nixon, which created unity, and it had an obtainable political goal, which was to end the war. And out of that movement, of course, there was also with two other movements. One was feminism, which was which was emerging as a powerful movement, not only in North America, but across the world. And at the same time, of course, you had this other movement, which was civil rights, which was iconic, which linked the struggle for racial equality in the United States to the Gandhian strategy of nonviolence and decolonization. So there was a lot happening, and that was a time of leadership and program and defined goals.
We can, John, after the fact, define those as social movements that achieved some significant things by historical standards. For sure. But we're standing in the present. How do we, and I don't mean this to sound as perhaps naive as it will sound, but how do you know a social movement when you see one if you're right in the thick of the middle of it?
Well, that's a good question. It seems to me that social movements they almost always have a combination of three factors if they're going to be successful. One is that they're building community, and we see that in spades with Occupy, that right on the face of it and the way they speak, people involved with Occupy keep talking about how they're changing relationships today. They're not making an instrumental case for policy change in particular. They're saying right here, right now, we're going to build our community. That's always a feature of social movements, it seems to me, because they are transforming daily relationships. The second thing that social movements seems to me always have going for them is they're changing the conversation for the wider society. So beyond themselves and those who are organized in whatever park or public space it happens to be, or coffee house, let's say, they're changing the terms of reference that are going on for the rest of us. And that's their outreach to the broader, what we now think of as the general public, which gives them huge leverage. The third thing, and maybe this is where Occupy becomes a counterexample, may prove the rule, is that social movements do achieve specific ends, and they usually articulate specific ends. And the reason they do that, I think, is that they come to see that unless they can lock down some institutional changes over time, it's very, very difficult to sustain the community building and the conversation changing unless you start to take over actual levers of power, places, institutions, schools, governments, and so on. So I think that becomes a part of social movement.
We're going to come back to the question of whether or not the Occupy movement is in fact doing the last thing that you just said. Adam, I want to bring you in at this point. Picking up on what Daniel Drache just had to say, most of the movements that we see in the streets, anti-Vietnam, anti-Iraq war, they tend to be movements of the left, supported by unions and that kind of thing. Placards, anti-war demonstrations, I think that's fair to say. Does the conservative movement, of which I think you are a proud member, about which you have written extensively, does it see itself in a different way, but similarly as a protest movement?
It's a great question. I think it did, but I think it's increasingly less and less so. As you said, the movements that have been out in the streets protesting in the past, in the modern past, at least from the 60s to the present, have traditionally been associated with the left. But since the advent of the internet, everything has changed. And now conservatives get organized at a grassroots level in the same way that the other side of the spectrum does. We've seen that in the States with, for example, the Tea Party movement. Conservatives have tended to always be people who are just a collection of individuals. They haven't necessarily followed a particular leader, and they are brought together by a series of ideas. So in the past, it's been a little bit more difficult to get them together, and the idea of going out into the streets, as conservative activists, has been anathema, even funny to conservatives. But today, because of the internet and because of what's happened, especially since 2008, we've seen more conservatives get organized in that way. Is it a protest movement? In Canada, for example, conservatism is doing fairly well right now. In the US, it's taken a step back. In fact, if you had told me 5 or 10 years ago that American conservatives would look to Canada for inspiration for the conservative movement, I would have laughed, but that's actually the case now. So I don't think in Canada we really look at ourselves as a protest movement anymore, but we certainly do still see ourselves as outsiders, I would say.
It is funny. I mean, Mike Harris used to say it too. We're not the government. We're the people who came to fix government. Preston Manning used to say it. Stephen Harper used to say it. We're outsiders. Ronald Reagan, of course, used to say it a lot. But when you control the levers of power, you're not really outsiders anymore. You can't beat that drum anymore, can you?
Well, we control the levers of power in the Canadian federal government at the moment. I mean, provincially, it's still very divided, and in the States, of course, the Democrats are in the White House, and all over the world, there's left of set. Looks like France, the left in France is going to take power. So
well, you've got the House of Representatives in the States, and sometimes 5 out of 9 votes on the Supreme Court.
Sure, but we have to make a distinction, Steve, between the conservative movement as an entity, as a nonpartisan entity that adheres to a certain body of ideas, and political parties of the right. Because as we've seen in recent history, when conservative parties take power, they don't necessarily act conservatively when in government. The Bush White House, for example, was one of the biggest spending administrations, probably the biggest spending administration in the history of the United States.
Okay, let's play some tape. I mentioned Preston Manning a second ago, and had a pretty significant influence on Canadian political life, founded a new political party, which has its roots in the Prime Minister's office today. He was on the agenda not too long ago, talking about some of the issues that we've been dealing with here today, and I want to play some tape and then come back and talk, okay? Roll tape, please.
I take maybe the lesson out of the reform movement that despite all the flaws in the current democratic system, and I've been a vehement critic of many of those flaws, a small group of people, started with 5, we're able to take the tools that democracy gives to us all, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to try to persuade your neighbor to do this or do that, or support this or support that. And with all the flaws in the system, we're able to change the national agenda. Not to the degree that we would have liked, but certainly changed it from what it was.
Sakura, he makes it sound fairly straightforward. You know, a small, committed band of people can make big things happen. Do you see it that way?
Oh, yes, I agree with it. It was a Margaret Mead quote originally, that never doubt that a few people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. With Occupy movement, we're actually a large group of people, you know, rather than just a handful of people conspiring to, you know, create these sorts of, you know, actions and protests and things like that. And I would love to contest the notion that we're a leaderless movement. In fact, I believe that we have many leaders. And we actually, the way we structure things, we encourage leadership, and we encourage the leadership of people to come with ideas on how they can change things. And we create a space where those ideas can get support. You know, not only you know, support with agreement, but support with people that are willing to put work behind these ideas. And I think that that's one of the key strategies of our movement, is to be a decentralized movement that creates a space so that many people can plug in, many people that have been activists for the first time.
John, this is a very controversial idea that they're proposing, which is, in essence, she says many leaders, but, you know, potentially to an outsider, this is a group. If you don't have one leader, you don't have a leader. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's old-fashioned thinking, but that's the way it looks. Can you do a movement this way with many thousands of leaders, not with one leader, and still at the end of the day get to the finish line?
That's you're right. That's an old-fashioned way of looking at it.
Well, you show me a precedent for how this works.
Well, it seems to me that what's very instructive to me about the Occupy movement is people that I hear speaking on behalf of Occupy, including Sakura, I don't hear them saying that there are no specific objectives that they want to achieve. I hear them saying that it's not the purpose of the Occupy grouping movement, whatever we call it, the physical instantiation of it in parks and places, physical places, to articulate specific policy objectives. Joseph Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, various leaders of business schools, including other types of public intellectuals, Daniel, for example, help to articulate those things. Those ideas then take hold in the media, they take hold amongst a wider circle of us, people like myself who are sympathetic but have professional jobs and so on. We start to articulate those things. And actually what I do hear from Occupy is that different components of that heterogeneous larger social movement will achieve things. And what they're saying about, for example, solidarity with the labor movement, that's the type of language that Occupy uses. What I hear them saying is they're ready to show up. When labor is ready to fight for what it wants to fight for, Occupy people will be there to give them what they can, what support they can. And actually that's very typical of all social movements, I would say, all successful ones. You have to maintain your social base outside of the existing political institutions. As Adam has, I think, highlighted, if your objectives are radical, then the existing social institutions or political institutions, they're not there to serve you. They're not helpful to you yet. You have to make a lot of changes over time. What you have to do is maintain your base socially while you manipulate those institutions. And we can look at examples like the environmental movement in North America, which I would argue lost its way to some extent by getting so involved in institutional policymaking that it did not maintain its social base. And now it's right to be beaten up essentially by its opponents.
They have leaders, though. Daniel, give me an example of a movement in history that didn't have, you know, thousands of leaders, but one or two or three or four. I mean, well, I can't think of one, frankly.
Yeah, I can't think of one either. And if you look at the feminist movement, they had a variety of leaders over time, and it changed the debate amongst women and shifted the agenda. So you have to have a visible leader, in part to give coherence, in part to articulate to a larger public what the obtainable goals are. And I think that, as I said, that this is a kind of what I call a social movement that is unprogrammed surprise. And so it announces new social actors. But I think that the model goes something like this. You have a huge period of innovative energy. Occupy Wall Street, occupy a park. Why? No one ever thought of that. And in fact, if you look back, when it first happened, people said, this is crazy, right? Why aren't you occupying, Goldman Sachs or one of the big firms. People sort of dismissed it. And similarly, I think, that's the first thing. Then you have a plateauing, right? After the kind of initial phase of activity when, they were expelled and kicked out of the parks. And then they have to sort of regroup and try to develop the movement to the next phase. But you need things that bind people together in a clear, coherent way. If not, you go into gradual decline and you recede.
Adam, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point about leaders. I think the fact that the Occupy movement doesn't have one or two clear leaders, like you've been saying, is a big problem for them. And I just think back to the interview before the panel got constituted, where you asked Amin what the goals were for the protest tomorrow, and I think you asked Sakura as well, and he said to have fun, and she said to bring out as many people as possible. These are not the kind of goals of a revolutionary movement that one would think is really going towards something tangible and achievable. I also think that another problem for the Occupy movement is that there are no, what I would call, mainstream champions for the cause in the political process, in the political system. The kinds of things that the Occupy movement is advocating for, no one in mainstream politics is on board for that kind of idea anymore. Not even the NDP. No one is talking about nationalizing business. No one is talking about overthrowing the old order, the rhetoric that they use. It's just not catching on.
Sakura?
Oh, well, I would disagree strongly with that. There's been many people that have come out in support of the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy movement, generally speaking. I actually did spend some time at Occupy Wall Street, and there was people coming by on a regular basis, lending their support, making speeches. For example, at Occupy Toronto, people like Judy Rebick, who, is the founder of Rabble, who's a very highly respected feminist and an activist.
He's saying no elected, it's probably not no, but very, very few elected people have come
that's
have come
partially
on board.
the choice of Occupy Toronto. It isn't that we haven't gotten support from these figures.
But if you want to get these changes, run for office and get someone elected who will make them.
Well, that's one theory of social change, but it's not the theory that we prescribe to. We are building people power. And I also want to contest the point that the purpose of the march was to get a lot of people out there. You asked what would be successful, and I said, well, of course, if we get a lot of people out, if we have, a good time and assert our values. We are there marching for migrant justice. We are there marching, for social services. We're there marching for many reasons, for environmental justice, for example. And the next day after the occupation, Occupy Toronto is actually going to support protests against various annual general meetings of mining companies. Both Barrick Gold and New Gold, both gold mining companies, are both having their annual general meetings in Toronto. And so the Occupy Toronto movement is going to support protests against that company in support of impacted communities that are coming to Toronto to represent their own undeniable perspectives against this company. So I'll let other people speak, but I just wanted to contest these points.
I had a comment that I think it's interesting, this question of what I call obtainable political goals as against general political goals. So it doesn't in any way, I think, minimize one's impact to have broader concerns around social justice and democracy, which the Occupy movement has. And I think this has kind of shaken up a lot of people and shaken up the consensus that we should just sort of go along with the political class and their austerity agenda. But I think the movement in Quebec is a bit different because it's a huge movement, right? Almost 3 months.
You're talking about the students in the street?
Yeah, the student strike in Quebec. Through 200,000 students been out, which seemed to be an impossible demand, right? A utopian demand, to say no to the 75% fee hike. So
you appreciate that the percentage of the students in the street is, now this is Quebec, you know it better than I do, but what is it?
About 30% of
30%
the students are on strike.
Yeah. So 70% are still going to class.
I was there. No, I don't. I was there on Thursday and Friday, and I was talking to various people in it. I mean, you have the CEGEPs, you have the UQAM, you don't have McGill, but you have much of Université de Montréal, Concordia. So you have the major institutions in Sherbrooke, etc. The point is that it ebbs and flows in all these movements, but they have a demand. That's the point I wanted to make about this, which is no to the fee hike and a change in financing of post-secondary education. Now, they may not get these goals, but this is why it's been able to be sustained over a long period, because they have leaders right? This is a very different movement that's occurring. They have leaders, they have this goal, they have support from political parties, and they support from civil society.
Okay, Adam, I want to bring you in and ask you more about what's going on in Montreal right now. These people in the streets, they seem to have a very clear objective. They want lower tuition rates. The question then becomes, is this a social movement, as we've been discussing it, or something else?
Well, I agree with what Daniel said, in that this is an example, which is why it's great to contrast it with Occupy, where you have a clear movement with clear objectives, with clear identifiable leaders. However, I think that the Quebec student movement and the tuition fee increase issue has morphed into something much larger than just about tuition fees. I was at an event not last Friday, but the Friday before, where Jean Charest was giving a speech about his Plan Nord, his plan to develop the northern part of Quebec and the mining and natural resources sector. And these protesters were outside and made life quite difficult for the people wanting to get in to see the speech. And it was clear from that this had grown into a movement about every perceived social injustice one can imagine. I mean, it wasn't just about tuition fees. So it is a movement because it has clear goals and they're easy to identify. But the school year is almost over, so we'll see if this continues into the summer months once students have gone off to work in summer jobs and do other things. But I would identify it as a movement, yes.
Okay, let me go ahead, Sakura.
Well, I just want to respond to that real quickly, because he's saying that, you know, it's become more than about the student fees, and, you know, is really kind of like hitting a nerve and inspiring people to get out on the street. Of course, there was Earth Day. Within the context of the student strikes, it attracted 250,000 people out into the streets. And so you're saying that, you know, what they're really out there protesting is every issue under the sun. And so that is very much, you know, an Occupy strategy where we're loaning support to other social movements and, you know, bringing the spotlight to them, because for some reason Occupy Toronto does get a lot of media attention where lots of these social movements unfortunately do not.
Okay, let me take this plane if I can and fly it up to 30,000 feet so we can take a much larger overarching view at this subject. I want to get a sense, John, to you first perhaps, can you make the kind of social change that we've been talking about here today without changing the actual physical institutions that are in charge of our society at the moment?
Well, I don't think so. I'm associating social movements with radical change. These are movements, whether right or left, that are seeking transformations that go beyond the existing institutions. And Occupy very much so fits that bill. I think the student protests in Montreal also fit that bill. We have to ask ourselves, why is it that different groups within society come together rather rapidly, in only a few months, in a rather radical form? They're in the streets or they're protesting, being arrested. These are not normal behaviors of people with mortgages and kids and daily worries. They are political. They're political in the largest sense. And those movements cannot achieve what they want in a short period of time within existing institutions, which is why political parties are not the institution for Occupy to turn to. I'm not saying I'm not critical of Occupy in my own way, but being practical, as we call it, or picking up goals that are achievable, it's not a philosophy. It's not an ideology. It's a question of timing. It's a question of strategy. And what you're looking for as a movement is what used to be called the transitional demand, something that lots and lots of people can agree with because it's so sensible. But it's very transformative over the long run. So the 8-hour workday was an example. Reproductive rights for women is another example. Dramatic campaign finance reform might be one example in the United States. So my charge to Occupy would be, you need to look for what that transitional demand is going to be. In the case of Montreal, I don't think it is just an issue of tuition. Tuition is a transitional demand. We're moving into an economy where vast amounts of higher education are required, and it's not realistic to say to middle-class families, all the risk is on you. You do all the higher education, and if it doesn't work out for you personally, tough. And I think that's actually what students have put their finger on, that it's a social question. How are we going to educate everybody? Why shouldn't it be universally free? It's changing the terms of debate. That's my point.
Let me come back to the first part with you, Daniel. Is the logical extension of all of these social movements, does it have to find itself at City Hall, at the provincial legislature, on Parliament Hill?
I think you asked a good question at the beginning. What is a social movement? It's really when you see it, right? Mm-hmm. So it has to be visible, and its secret resource is really to change public opinion, to educate the public, forge a new consensus on big issues which are being neglected or marginalized in the political system. So I think, of course, what is different about this is they're messy. They don't fit into any kind of template, easy to follow or understand model of change. That's the first point. I think the second point is they're intergenerational. So if you look at the students in Quebec, their view is that disinvestment in education, dumping education on the individual is wrong, and they don't accept it. Now you can say lowest fees in Canada, that they should pay their way. This is not part of the debate, because in an intergenerational conflict, these people are saying, no, that's the important thing.
Sorry, hit me with that again. Facts are not part of the debate?
No, not facts are part of the debate, but if you say, as Charest says, well, you're the lowest paid in Canada, the rationale is you go to university, you should assume a larger share of your educational fees. They're not opposed to paying fees, but what they're saying is that it's an unfair or undue burden. Remember, 1960, we were a poor society and we were able to do much more in great institutions, hospitals, universities, industrial policy, support business. So 40 years ago, we had a very different approach to building social networks and a sense of national agenda and provincial agendas. This is gone. So the students in an intergenerational conflict are saying, we have a stake in society, and what you are proposing as austerity is the wrong way to go.
He's right in a sense about the fact that facts are not really a part of that debate, because even though Quebecers pay the lowest tuition fees in the country, and even though after the increase they would still pay the lowest tuition fees in the country, and even though after the hike it would still be representing 17% of the true cost of a university education, these types of facts and stats just don't really play a part in the debate. It's become a lightning rod for expressing frustration about the Charest government and the difficult state of young people, the economy, the fact that they see debt burdens coming if they have higher fees, these types of things. It's not really about the numbers.
But I'm inferring from what you're saying that the numbers ought to matter in this conversation.
They ought to, but it just, when you try to make that case, it just goes ignored.
But it's very much like the case that unionized workers make more than non-unionized workers. Well, that's true. But we keep hearing in English Canada at least, well, that's not fair, you make more. The question is it a fair wage? Is it fair that teachers make what they make after all the education they get and the social service they provide? Absolutely, it's fair. Do they make more than non-unionized workers? Yes. But that's a different way of looking at the facts.
Okay. And if we want to talk about facts, I mean, let's talk about the $35 billion that are being, used to buy fighter jets, or the prison expansion that's going on at the same time that they're cutting services like education. I mean, people are very angry at the priorities of the government, on a provincial, on a federal, and on a municipal level.
Sorry, how do you know?
Well, we see that in our
How do I know?
Hang on, I'm just asking a simple question. You say people are angry at the priorities of this federal government. Mm-hmm. How do you know?
Well, I know because people are, mobilizing in things like Occupy. I mean, the fact is that in Montreal and in Ontario, the situations are ripe for a social movement. With the priorities of our government, taking money away from social services, putting them into policing, putting them into prisons, putting them into war. And people want to have some outlet to express that.
No, fair
and
enough.
Occupy was new.
So my question is it enough for a social movement to change attitudes? Or do you have to, at the end of the day, actually change a government, change a policy, change a law, etc.?
Well, I mean, I think that these policy changes and everything will fall out of building the people power and expressing, what we want and the values that we want to see reflected in society.
How?
It isn't about lobbying over this specific bill or that specific bill. It's about mobilizing. It's about being present. At Occupy, we realize that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way that things are going, with the agenda of government that's imposed on everybody else. And so what we're doing is we're creating a space so that those people can get together. And, we're having discussions, and we're planning actions, and we're hoping to attract more people and more people with passion, and, we are supporting so many other social movements at the same time.
The question still unanswered for many people is, to what end?
Other actors tend to move
hang on.
and take advantage.
I would love to
To what end? I still haven't heard you say whether you want to change attitudes, if that's enough, or want to change a government, want to change a law, want to change a policy, want to change a prime minister? To what end?
I think that Occupy has very clear, branding. We are the 99%. people's needs, not corporate greed, and that can be applied to many different ends. For example, protecting safety nets while taking money away from prisons. I mean, it's ridiculous what's going on right now. They just announced cuts to rehab programs at the same time that they're building more prisons, and this is costing billions. The social services that they're cutting are costing millions.
Okay, John.
Well, I think social movements have the effect of opening up space and creating opportunities for other actors. The fact that Occupy is publicly less than a year old, I find it absurd to say, well, where's their program? I mean, where's the program of our government? Where's the program of the United States government for rising inequality, for climate change, which is a civilizational catastrophe in the making? Even if we don't think it's a catastrophe, it's a major challenge. And what we find is that people under 35, they're very mobilized around climate change. Are we listening? Not really. Our political institutions are run by folks my age, folks your age. It's a very straightforward dynamic in some ways that social movements rise incoherently because people are angry. And there's a lot of frustration. Sometimes they become right-wingers. In France, there's a right-wing working class movement. But the economy is constantly transforming our social relations. It's constantly throwing us into confusion, taking away our jobs, changing our income streams, changing the education we need to have. And why aren't we asking the question, so to what end? This capitalist economy is for what exactly? What we see is responses from people like Occupy who get angry and they mobilize, and we want to come around the question, what's your program?
But in the end, okay, we have a problem here because, of course, social movements also can be living in a silo, in their own silo, because even though
that's what's happening
I think
right
that's
now.
an absolute risk. I agree.
So of course, if you're in a social movement, you say you want to broaden and deepen, but there's a problem that you don't trust political parties, but then you've cut yourself off from the kind of mainstream, because when Steve says, well, what's your goal? The goal is, well, I think this is a big question, because if you look back and you think theoretically and analytically, you want to have a big impact. So what does it mean to have a big impact? If you're in a situation where women aren't being hired, you want affirmative action. If you want workers to be protected, you want certain laws. So you have to have, I would argue, you have to have obtainable ends, or in the end, you just have a lot of talk and you don't have very much outcome. Now, I don't think to say this means that Occupy should be something else. But I think you have to think long and hard. If you are a social actor today, is how to maximize your impact. Or else, what John says is right, you will create situations for other actors to take advantage. So this is a problem. This is a problem.
John's not sold, Daniel. Come on back.
I'm not sold that nothing's changed. I'm not sold that it isn't a major change in the conversation that once Caterpillar in Ontario made its proposal and locked out its workers, there was significant national media coverage for a change about workers' rights in a specific case, which I hadn't seen in a number of years. There was a decline of that discourse. The NDP in Ontario just won a tax increase for people earning over $500,000. I think that was significant. I don't think the tax increase itself is so significant, but it's amazing that we're now talking about this again. We're talking about tax increases for social programs.
Can I ask you,
which hasn't happened?
Here's the follow-up question, though. Adam, I'll go to you with this. What's interesting about that situation? Is it the fact that it happened because two people and their chiefs of staff who got elected met in a room, or that there were 200,000 people in the street demanding it?
Or that there's two people in the room.
My point is, there weren't 200,000 people in the street demanding it. This happened because two people who got elected worked out a deal.
That's not the way I see it. As a pollster and someone who runs focus groups all the time, I see a distinct shift in the middle ground of politics to opening up people's ears that maybe, just maybe, this isn't really working.
There wasn't a single protest in the street for people demanding a
Why would the
surtax on
NDP
fire.
take that step? I mean, of course, there's a minority government, so we can say, well, there's a proximate cause. But there are ultimate and proximate causes. The ultimate cause has more to do with the fact that conversation has actually changed. Same with the tar sands.
But I think this is a different point. This is a different point.
Daniel than Adam on this.
You have an interesting situation where you have minority governments. It forces political parties to negotiate a different kind of agenda, and to actually, in part, reflect one of your goals. Right, is to change the distribution of wealth in society, and saying fair taxation. So that comes because you have a minority government. But if people under 30 don't vote, right, you're going to end up having Harper re-elected for a second term, or having the Conservatives in Ontario come to power, right? So it does matter. It does matter structurally, institutionally, what's happening around you. Social movements have to take note of it.
Adam.
Engage.
The budget deal had nothing to do with any sort of social movement whatsoever. It had to do with the fact that the NDP wanted a feather in its cap so it could claim that it had a major influence over the way the budget had gone.
Although they would argue they were acting on behalf of people who hang out with Sakura.
They might, but it's still perfectly ideologically within the parameters of where the NDP has always been.
Mm-hmm.
Has anything changed? Yes, there's no question about that, because this small minority, which is the Occupy movement, is now more organized than it was before, and it has a clear voice. There's no question that things have changed. But until they find a way to articulate what they believe in a way that really animates and excites average people, there's no way that they'll be able to implement anything that they want to do. And I'll give you an example. She said that she'd like to, or that there's a protest going on this week at the Barrick Gold annual meeting. You know, most Canadians just want to have a nice retirement, and they want to have good schools for their kids, and they want to have a nice house. And a lot of people probably have Barrick shares in their retirement portfolio. So the fact that you're against Barrick Gold would not necessarily excite people or bring more people to your side. You see what I mean? So until you find a way to meet the large mass in the middle and somehow convince them that what you want to do is in their interests, I don't see how you can mainstream what you're doing. And until you do, it'll remain a fringe minority.
I've got a minute and a half left here, so Sakura, why don't you take it? Respond.
I think addressing human rights abuses in an environment where there's actually no laws to prevent Canadian companies from abusing human rights abroad is something that the Occupy movement should be supporting. This isn't, playing a huge role in our messaging that we're projecting outwards. Like I said, people's needs, not corporate greed. We are supporting many different movements for justice, and that's one of the roles of the Occupy movement.
But what about his
I believe
point
that we are articulating, many things that people identify with, and that's been shown by the fact that we've been able to change the public debate around these issues. The 99%, the issue of wealth disparity, the issue of corporate greed, those are getting more media attention than they ever have before. And I think that if people want to engage, they should come out. They should physically come out and experience the encampments that we produce and have conversations with the people that are attracted to this. It's an incredible experience.
You want to give us a little hint about what you're going to occupy tomorrow? Is it a public place or a private company?
It's going to be in downtown Toronto, and we're going to leave at 9 o'clock from Alexandra Park to march to that location. It's going to be 24 hours. We're going to clean up after ourselves, and you can follow hashtag May1TO on Twitter to find out where.
Okay. Thanks to all of you for coming in tonight for our conversation. This was most illuminating. Sakura Saunders, activist, Occupy Toronto. Be safe out there in the streets tomorrow. Adam Daifala, co-founder and partner of Hatley Strategy Advisors. Daniel Drace, professor of political science, York University. John Willis, director, campaigns and research, Stratcom. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.